In my family, we tell stories about things. Some of them are about each other, and sometimes they're funny, so we can all laugh again at something that happened and made us chuckle. Sometimes they're inspiring, as when someone did a brave or generous deed. Sometimes they're angry, as we are still working out how we've been hurt or insulted. Frequently, there are a retelling of our family history. I know many of you have heard me tell that my grandmother lived part of her childhood in a sod house on the prairie of Nebraska. My children have heard the story of my grandfather being one of the founders of a newspaper in Nebraska, and have also heard about a freight company on the frontier. They've also heard about one of Nancy's ancestors who escaped from a Union prison camp in Detroit and went to Canada and became the father and grandfather of people who ultimately were her mother's family. Of course, there are also the more fantastical stories, those about fishing trips, or about our times in college in the 1960s, or about other parts of experience that help to explain us to ourselves. And while all of our stories are truthful, the facts do sometimes tend to drift sideways. Only as we grow older do we come to understand that this serves a higher purpose than just entertainment. In telling and hearing our stories, we gain an awareness of who we were, and therefore who we are. At the same time, and in a very subtle fashion, we're also given some notion of what and who we're supposed to become. Our stories give us clues about where we fit into our community, in the region we live in the nation, and ultimately in the universe. Our stories tell us what it means to have the names we inherited, the meanings attached to the places where we live, and the sort of persons who shared those names and those places before us. It's very difficult not to have a strong sense of history, at least of our own, when it's recited almost like liturgy, year after year. The resurrection appearance reported in today's gospel reading is a story intended for those of us who were not in the inner circle. This resurrection appearance involves ordinary followers of Jesus like us, people who were part of the followers of Jesus but who played minor roles and who were not always mentioned by name in the dispatches. The two people involved in this report are so obscure that we know almost nothing about either of them. Indeed, one of them is not even named. They are ordinary foot soldiers in Jesus' camp. That fact should make each of us feel right at home. What we do know about them is that they were disciples, students and followers of Jesus. We know that they were on their way to the town of Emmaus. We know that the subject of Jesus' death dominated their conversation and that they were deeply discouraged. As they walked along, a stranger joined them. That was nothing out of the ordinary. Strangers often attached themselves to groups. Safety in travel was no small matter. The stranger took some pains to be included in their conversation. He asked what they were talking about. The two disciples were dumbfounded. They could not believe that anyone could have been in Jerusalem over the past several days and yet fail to know what had happened. And they said so. The resurrected but unrecognized Jesus played straight man for them. He asked the appropriate questions, and the two disciples spilled out to him the deep burden of their hearts. This was not idle conversation. These people were in pain. They recited their story of Jesus as they had come to know him. They recounted the dreams they had started to dream. They rehearsed dreams that had seemed so real, so possible because of their life with Jesus. Easily the most poignant line of this explanation is, we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. We had hoped. Nothing hurts quite so much as shattered hopes. Nothing is quite so painful as a dream of something long desired that ends suddenly and unfulfilled. Nothing is quite so bitter as the taste of reality that a dying dream leaves behind. These people were suffering from that kind of a loss. In response to their distress, Jesus told them a story. In fact, he told them a great many stories. Before he was done, Jesus had reviewed for them the the scriptural foundation on which their hope for a Messiah had been built. None of the stories were new to these disciples. They'd heard them since they were old enough to hear, and they heard them clearly this time. They heard them, but they didn't fully hear them. They heard them, but they didn't recognize the power behind the words they were hearing. Because they didn't hear fully, the stranger who was talking with them remained a stranger. Indeed, he remained a stranger to them until they sat down for the evening meal. At the table, even though the stranger was the invited guest, he took the role of host. He took the bread, said the blessing, and broke the bread. Luke's account of the gospel doesn't tell us what words Jesus used to bless the bread. But whatever words they were used, it was in that moment, the moment of the blessing of the bread, that changed the very meaning of bread forever, that mere hearing was replaced with recognition. The disciples realized that they had been in the presence of their risen Lord through most of that long afternoon. We're told that they had reached their destination for the day and that night had fallen. We know that travel at night was a dangerous undertaking in that place and time. We also know that these two disciples abandoned their evening meal and the safety of their lodging and lost no time in returning to Jerusalem. Tradition says that they ran to Jerusalem. They ran because they had news that was too good to wait, never mind the danger. The Lord is risen, and the rest of the community needs to hear about it. This resurrection story is for all of us, the rank and file of the followers of Jesus Christ. It affirms for us that the risen Lord is with us. It also gives us a clue to the sort of response we ought to make. We're engaged in the same sort of journey as those two disciples on the road to Emmaus. We seek our risen Lord in the community of the faithful, the church. When we gather as the church, we hear the word of God, we bless and break the bread, and the presence and power of the risen Christ is made clear to us. As the community of the faithful, we are strengthened and fed for our journey. We're strengthened so that we may tell our story to a world that desperately needs to hear it. Our task to share our story with the world is the way we can fit ourselves into the story of Cleopas and his companion. There's a story from the Hasidic tradition that speaks to the importance of this. There was a rabbi, the Baal Shem Tov, who lived in Eastern Europe, a saint and the founder of the Hasidic movement, who taught that God is to be found in dance and song and story. It's said that one day villagers came to him because they were threatened by a great plague, and they asked that he save them. And so the Baal Shem Tov went to a sacred place in the wood and lit a sacred fire that had no flame, and spoke the words of an ancient sacred prayer. He implored God to save his people, not because of his merits, but because of all this sacred ancient wisdom that was gathered together. And the village was saved. A generation passed, and another renowned rabbi now led the Hasidim. And again, villagers came to him, now threatened by a great flood, and asked for his prayers of salvation. So he went to the sacred place in the wood and said the words of the sacred prayer, but he didn't know how to light the sacred fire that had no flame. But it was enough, and the people were saved. And so in each generation something was lost, until a nameless rabbi in some village, now lost from memory, was approached by desperate villagers, pleading for his help so that they might be saved from yet another disaster. Sitting alone after they had left, he prayed aloud, "I know so little, for it has all been lost. Not only do I not know how to light the sacred fire that has no flame, but I cannot find the sacred place in the wood, and I do not even know the words of the ancient sacred prayer. But I know the story." And the story was enough. Each of us bears not only our individual stories, but our common story as the people of God. We need to share that story. And as the unnamed rabbi discovered, the story is enough.